In 1889, a man stood before a crowd in Cincinnati, Ohio. He was 9 feet 2 inches tall. His hands could wrap around a grown man's torso. His voice carried across an entire fairground without needing to shout. They called him Colonel Ruth Goshen, the Palestinian giant. And the words he spoke that day, just weeks before he disappeared from history forever, were recorded by a reporter who didn't understand what he was hearing. But we do now, because what Goshen said wasn't a confession, it was a warning. The crowd that gathered wasn't there for entertainment. They were there because rumours had been spreading for months. Whispers about men and women of enormous height being systematically hunted, catalogued and disappeared. Goshen wasn't the first, he was one of the last. And on that humid August afternoon, standing in front of hundreds of witnesses, he told them exactly why his kind was being erased from the earth. However, the official record says none of this happened. According to history books, giants were myths, sideshow attractions, medical anomalies that died young and left no trace. But newspaper archives from the 1800s tell a different story. They tell of giant skeletons discovered in burial mounds across North America, of bones that measured over 8 feet in length, of skulls with double rows of teeth, and of institutions like the Smithsonian that collected these remains, logged them meticulously, and then made them vanish. Before we go any further, if you're the kind of person who questions official narratives and wants to understand what they're hiding from us, hit subscribe right now. This channel exists to dig up the evidence they buried, and what we're about to uncover will make you question everything you thought you knew about human history. Colonel Ruth Goshen was born in Jerusalem in 1837. At least, that's what the sideshow posters claimed. The truth is more complicated. Records show a man named Ruth Goshen did exist, but his origin story changed depending on who was telling it. Some newspapers called him Palestinian, others said Turkish. A few claimed he was from Syria. What never changed was his height, 9 feet 2 inches, verified by multiple physicians, documented in medical journals, photographed standing next to normal-sized men who barely reached his chest. Goshen arrived in America in 1881, brought over by showmen who saw profit in spectacle. But he wasn't like other attractions. He spoke multiple languages fluently. He could read and write in English, Arabic and Hebrew. Newspaper interviews from the time describe him as unnaturally intelligent, with an encyclopedic knowledge of ancient history that baffled academics who tried to stump him. One reporter from the Cincinnati Enquirer wrote that Goshen could recite genealogies going back thousands of years, naming bloodlines and dynasties that mainstream scholars insisted never existed. He travelled with P.T. Barnum's circus for a while, but the partnership didn't last. Goshen refused to be treated as a freak. He insisted on being called Colonel, a title he claimed was legitimate from his time serving in the Ottoman military. Barnum wanted a monster. Goshen gave him a scholar who happened to be 9 feet tall. They parted ways in 1884 and Goshen went independent, touring smaller venues across the Midwest. That's when things started getting strange. Other giants were disappearing. Not dying, disappearing. In 1885, a woman named Anna Swan, 7 feet 11 inches tall, died under mysterious circumstances in Ohio. Her body was supposed to be buried in a standard cemetery. Instead, it was exhumed within 48 hours by representatives claiming to be from a medical college. The college denied ever sending anyone. Her remains were never recovered. A year later, another giant named Martin Van Buren Bates, 7 feet 9 inches, tried to sue the Smithsonian Institution for attempting to purchase his skeleton before he was even dead. The lawsuit was thrown out on technicality and Bates went into hiding. He died in 1919 and his grave was immediately robbed. His coffin was found open empty, with no investigation ever launched. Goshen watched all of this happen, and he started talking. Not to crowds, not in interviews, but to people he trusted. A boarding house owner in Louisville later testified that Goshen told her giants were being systematically erased because they were evidence of something the establishment couldn't allow to exist. Evidence of the old world, evidence of Tartaria. Now, before you write this off as conspiracy nonsense, understand what Tartaria actually was. Maps from the 1700s and 1800s show an enormous territory across Asia labelled as Tartary or Grand Tartary. This wasn't a fringe thing. These were official maps printed by cartographers in London, Paris and Amsterdam. Encyclopedias from the 1800s contain entries about Tartarian people, their culture, their architecture. And then, suddenly, around 1850, Tartaria vanished from every map, every encyclopedia, every official record, as if it never existed. Goshen claimed he was descended from Tartarian bloodlines, that his ancestors were builders of the old empire, the one that constructed massive stone structures with precision that modern engineering still can't replicate. He said the reason giants were being hunted wasn't medical research. It was about hiding the evidence that a previous advanced civilization existed and was deliberately destroyed. In 1889, Goshen was scheduled to speak at the Cincinnati Exposition. This wasn't a circus act. It was billed as an academic lecture. He was going to present evidence of giant skeletons found in North American burial mounds, compare them to skeletal remains documented in Tartary, and argue that they represented a single widespread culture that predated accepted history. He never got to give that lecture, but he did speak to the crowd that gathered outside the exposition hall when organisers suddenly cancelled his event, with no explanation. The Cincinnati Commercial Tribune sent a reporter named Jacob Haas to cover what they thought would be a minor disturbance. Instead, Haas documented something far more significant. According to Haas, Goshen stood on the exposition steps, towering over the crowd, and began speaking in a voice that carried like thunder. He didn't shout, he didn't rage, he spoke calmly, methodically, and the crowd fell silent. Haas transcribed his words almost verbatim, publishing them in an article on August 14, 1889. That article sat in newspaper archives for over a century before researchers started connecting the dots. Goshen said this: "They tell you we are abnormalities, mistakes of nature, medical curiosities to be studied and forgotten. But we are the last echoes of the world that came before this one. The world they burned, the world they buried, the world they rewrote out of your history so you would never ask why your buildings are too grand for the people who supposedly built them. So you would never question why your oldest structures have doors and ceilings made for men twice your height." He continued, "I have seen the bones of my ancestors pulled from the earth. I have watched men in fine suits load them into crates and swear those crates would go to museums. But they never arrive at museums. They arrive at private collections, at university basements that no student is allowed to enter, at Smithsonian warehouses where they are catalogued, buried, and denied." The crowd didn't boo him. They didn't laugh. According to Haas, they stood frozen. Because what Goshen was describing wasn't theory, it was something many of them had heard whispers about. Newspapers across America had been reporting giant skeleton discoveries for decades. The Middletown Signal in Ohio reported an 8-foot skeleton found in a burial mound in 1883. The New York Times covered a 9-foot skeleton discovered in West Virginia in 1884. The San Diego Union wrote about multiple giant skeletons unearthed during railroad construction in 1886. And in every case, the bones were handed over to the Smithsonian or other institutions, logged into official records, and then vanished. When researchers tried to locate them years later, they were told the records were incomplete, the bones were lost, or they never existed in the first place. Goshen knew this because he had tried to track them down himself. He told the crowd he had written to the Smithsonian multiple times, requesting access to the giant remains they had collected. His letters were either ignored or met with vague responses claiming no such collection existed. But Goshen had receipts, literally. He carried with him signed documents from burial mound excavators who confirmed that giant bones had been sent to Washington, D.C. He showed these documents to the crowd that day. Then Goshen said the part that got him disappeared. "You wonder why we are the last. You wonder where the others went. I will tell you. They were not allowed to breed. They were not allowed to gather. They were paid to perform, to be spectacles. And when they refused, they were taken in the night. I have received letters, offers, men who want to study me, men who want to preserve me, men who promise wealth if I simply agree to donate my body to science before I am even dead. And when I refuse, the offers turn to threats." He pulled out a letter from his coat and read it aloud. The letter was from an unnamed medical institution offering Goshen $5,000, an enormous sum in 1889, if he would sign a contract bequeathing his skeleton to their collection upon his death. The letter explicitly stated they would arrange for his remains to be transferred immediately upon expiration to prevent any competing claims. Goshen called it a death contract, a promise that the moment he died he would be carved up and displayed like an animal. The crowd erupted, shouting, anger. Haas wrote that several men tried to rush the exposition building, demanding answers from the organisers who had cancelled Goshen's lecture. Police arrived within minutes, Goshen was escorted away, and the crowd was dispersed. The Tribune published Haas's article the next day. 2 days later, the newspaper printed a retraction, claiming Haas had fabricated the entire story and had been terminated for journalistic misconduct. Haas himself vanished from public record shortly after. And Goshen, he disappeared within weeks. His last confirmed sighting was in September 1889 in Louisville, Kentucky. After that, nothing. No death certificate, no burial record, no obituary. The man simply ceased to exist in official documentation. Sideshow historians later claimed he died of natural causes and was buried in an unmarked grave. But they couldn't say where, when, or provide any evidence it happened. What we do know is that within 6 months of Goshen's disappearance, reports of giant skeleton discoveries in American newspapers dropped off dramatically. Excavations that previously made headlines were suddenly handled quietly, with bones sent directly to institutions and no public announcements. By 1900, the giant skeleton stories had almost entirely stopped appearing in mainstream press. The Smithsonian Institution has been directly asked about their giant skeleton collection multiple times over the past century. Their official position is that they have no such collection, that reports of giant skeletons were either hoaxes or misidentifications of normal skeletons, and that no credible evidence of a race of giants has ever been found. But researchers have uncovered internal Smithsonian documents from the 1890s referencing anomalous skeletal remains of unusual height being stored in restricted archives. When pressed, the institution claims those documents refer to remains that were later determined to be fraudulent and discarded. Discarded, that's the word they use. Thousands of skeletal remains meticulously documented by field researchers, excavated from burial mounds and ancient sites, simply discarded because they didn't fit the accepted narrative. No public disclosure, no scientific debate, just erased. This wasn't unique to America. Similar patterns occurred in Europe and Asia. In the late 1800s, Russian explorers documented enormous skeletal remains found in ancient Tartarian cities. French archaeologists reported giant bones discovered in burial sites across Siberia. British colonial administrators in India wrote about skeletons of unusual height found in ancient temple complexes, and in every case the bones were collected by institutions, logged, and then lost. The documentation exists. The bones do not. Goshen's final warning wasn't about himself. It was about what his existence represented. If giants were real, if they were widespread, if they built the structures we attribute to smaller civilizations, then the entire timeline of human history collapses. The narrative that we evolved linearly from primitives to modernity falls apart, and the establishment couldn't allow that. Because if Tartaria was real, if it was a massive empire that spanned continents and built in stone with technology we still can't replicate, then the reset wasn't a natural disaster. It was deliberate. It was a controlled demolition of a previous world order, and the giants were the last living evidence that had to be erased. The buildings are still here. The massive doors, the impossibly high ceilings in 1800s, railway stations and government halls. The stonework that precision machinery struggles to match. The world fairs of the late 1800s, where temporary structures of breathtaking beauty were built in months, used for a year, and then demolished completely. Structures that official history claims were made of plaster and wood, even though photographs show stone and steel. Goshen saw all of this. He knew what he was, he knew what his bloodline represented, and he knew they couldn't let him speak freely, because once people started asking questions about the giants, they'd start asking questions about everything else, about the mud flood, about the orphan trains, about why so many old world maps show continents and cities that don't match modern geography, about why the official timeline insists that humanity went from medieval feudalism to industrial revolution in just a few decades. His final words to that crowd in Cincinnati weren't just a warning about his own fate. They were a warning about ours, that history is written by those who benefit from the forgetting, that physical evidence can be collected and destroyed, that entire civilizations can be erased from memory within a single generation if the institutions controlling information decide it's necessary. The last giant who spoke told the crowd the truth, and they took him away for it, not because he was lying, but because he wasn't. If you made it this far, you're not someone who just accepts what you're told. Subscribe to this channel, because we're going to keep digging up what they buried, and the rabbit hole goes deeper than you think.